My name is Michael Rosen for the Archive of American Television. It is my pleasure to interview Julia Child on June 25th, 1999, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, good morning. Can you state your full name, please?
My name is Julia Child. I don't use my other name. It was Julia McWilliams Child. That's so cumbersome for someone in the TV business.
So, McWilliams was the name you were born with?
Yes.
And do you have any nicknames?
Well, my brother, I won't even say what my brother used to call me. Juke and Jukey, but that's years ago. Juke the Puke, that was what my brother called me.
So I would assume that it's an older brother?
No, there are three of us in our family. He's the middle one.
Middle one. When were you born?
I was born in Pasadena, California, August 15th, 1912.
Did you grow up in Pasadena?
I grew up had a very happy life. I grew up there. I went up to Marin County for grade school, but I went up to there. I was always in Pasadena. It was a lovely, lovely place to grow up. And that was before World War II, so there wasn't that industrial smog at all. You could see the mountains. It was really lovely. The orange trees and so forth.
What did your parents do?
See, my mother came from New England. She came from Western Massachusetts, and her family were in the paper business. It was called the Byron Weston Permanent Linen Ledger. That was when everything was written by hand in ledger books. And she went to Smith College. She was in the class of 1900, which they called Naughty Naught. I was entered at Smith the day I was born, so I couldn't have refused. And then she met my father, who grew up outside of Chicago. She met him at the Chicago World's Fair. It must have been in the 1900s at some point. And so they moved out, when they were married, they moved out to Pasadena. My grandfather, when he was a young man, I guess just a teenager, went with two of his cousins out to California in a covered wagon. That was in the 49er days. And he liked it so much out there that when he retired at age 65, he moved out to Pasadena and lived to be 97.
Amazing.
No, it is. I think it's amazing that anyone survived that long trip across the country. And those wagons had no springs. I don't know how they did it. Only the tough survived, I think.
Really, it's just a different world.
Certainly was.
Yeah. What was your mother's name?
Julia Carolyn Weston. She was called Caro, C-A-R-O.
And your father's name?
John. So everyone in the family is named John. All the men are.
So what did you do for hobbies as you were growing up? Anything come to mind?
I don't know, I just had a good time. And in those days, women weren't taken very seriously as anything but just brood mares. There were no jobs. You could be a nurse or a teacher or a secretary, but you couldn't be a financial tycoon because it just wasn't done. I wasn't preparing myself for anything.
Did you read? Were you an avid reader?
Well, I wasn't an intellectual. I read whatever was going on there. What did I have as hobbies? I played golf and tennis, and I was leading really a leisurely butterfly life. And after college, what did I do? It's all so long ago. I guess I stayed home for about a year, then I went to New York to find my fortune. I wanted to be a great woman novelist or something like that.
Well, before we go to New York, I want to ask you if well, you said you went to Marin
Mhm.
County at one point, which is in Northern California,
Mm-hmm.
and was that for school?
Yes, I went to grade school there.
For how many
Well,
years?
girls' boarding school. I entered my sophomore year there, and then graduated. So I was there about 3 years.
What kind of student were you?
Well, I got by. I wasn't brilliant. I wasn't an academic. Nothing had turned me on at all. But I had always had a good time and got through everything. But there were no careers in the future because there weren't any.
Did you ever watch plays, or did you get involved in
We
theater?
went a lot to the theater and amateur junior league plays. I was usually something like a fish or something like that. And just before the war, I wrote a junior league play myself, where the heroine was a large princess. Never got produced.
What inspired you to write?
Well, I enjoyed the theater. I'm a natural ham. So I wanted to be in the play and the star of the play, so I wrote it. I don't know whatever happened to it.
It's fantastic. Did the Depression affect your family at all?
No, we were comfortably off. We weren't rich, but we were perfectly comfortable enough to send people to private schools. But in those days, they weren't nearly as expensive as now. But everybody in those days, in the teens and the 20s, there were always servants, cooks, and maids, and so forth, because they were cheap. You housed them yourself, and they had come over from Ireland and Germany and so forth, and they all disappeared in the 30s, or just about. So one lived with a cook and a maid, even sort of moderate income people. Those days were long gone.
In 1934, you graduated from Smith College.
Mm-hmm.
What did you major in?
I majored in English because you could take almost anything you wanted. So I just got through perfectly well. I had no trouble, but I was far from brilliant because I really wasn't turned on.
So, did you know what you wanted to do after you had graduated from college?
No, there wasn't anything really to do. You could get married and be a social person, but you didn't go in for a career because there weren't any. If you're an academic and an intellectual, that was something different. But for ordinary people, I think that's one reason so many capable women went into volunteer work, like the Junior League and the hospital and so forth, because there was nothing else. And I think now there's very little of that, because anyone who wants a career gets one. Well, this was really a leisure class society it wasn't until World War II that everything really changed.
You mentioned earlier that you went to New York City. What prompted you to go across the United States to New York?
Well, I guess the fun and the adventure. And I decided I'd get a job in New York. I wanted to, of course, naturally, first tried the New Yorker and then Time magazine. And I finally ended up at W.J. Sloan's Furniture Company in the advertising and promotion department. But that was on Fifth Avenue and 47th at that time. I was paid $18 a week, but you could live a very limited but perfectly decent life on that amount. I think our apartment, we got an apartment with two of my friends, and it was $80 a month. See, so that wasn't terribly expensive.
How long do you stay in New York?
I must have been there 2 or 3 years. I don't remember. But I remember I would have if I weren't doing anything else, I'd have a 50-cent lunch across the street, which was a 3-course lunch. Perfectly simple. You'd have, a soup and a fish and vegetables and a dessert for 50 cents, and I would tip them 5 cents. Then I began to realize that wasn't quite enough, so it went up to 10 cents. But it's amazing when you go back, the prices. But of course, they went along with your salary too.
Right.
But 18, that was about what people of my capacity got, secretaries and so forth.
Then after New York, you stayed there for a couple of years, you said.
Mm-hmm. Well, then the war came along. Or why did I leave? Or did I leave? I think my mother, I just don't quite remember. I think my mother became ill. Her family all had high blood pressure, which is interesting. Why, when they all came from Western Massachusetts, did all of them have high blood pressure? Was it inherited, or was it what they ate? Nobody knows. But she died when she was around 60. I think I went back there, and that was what happened. I went back there and took care of my father, and then my sister, and then by that time the war was beginning, and my sister came back, so I immediately left for Washington to get a job there. Because at that time women were being used.
What was the attitude towards the war in your town?
Oh, when everyone was dying to do something, we felt that we were helping our country. There was no question the way it was during the Vietnam War, whether things were right or wrong. You wanted to get in and help. Everyone did that I knew of. And we all landed in Washington. It was great fun. You saw all the people you'd grown up with and people you'd worked with and so forth. And I got a terrible job because I really wasn't qualified for anything. I could typewrite. But I got a job it was called Mellett's Madhouse. It was the U.S. Information Agency. If you were in Washington, I could look you up and find out where you started out and what you were doing and where you were now. On little 3x5 cards. I just typed and typed. And when I finally left, they had to get 2 people to replace me. But I was angry that I should be in such a horrible kind of a job. And then I had friends who were in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. So I managed to get in there. But again, it was in the files, but at least I was in the executive files of William J. Donovan, known as Wild Bill, who had been a hero in World War I and ran a successful law firm in New York. And he started a secret agency of, I guess, what you would, they had offices in Europe, and there were secret agents.
So the OSS became the CIA.
After the war.
Right.
But it was run by General Donovan, and he was a rather smallish, rumpled man with very, very bright blue eyes, and it was always said that he could read a book just by sort of turning the pages like that, which is amazing. I've never heard of anyone else. So I was in his files, but I never knew him really, except I was sort of the cat looking at the king or the mouse looking at the cat. But he was a fascinating fellow. And then, after being in those files for some time, they were starting in what was known as the Emergency Air Sea Rescue Equipment section. These were for people who were downed at sea and were in a rubber boat floating around in the Pacific. And this was How to Survive. This was run by, this was the inspiration of Harold Coolidge and Henry Field. Henry Field was related to the Marshall Field, Chicago storm and all that big family. And we were down in the Army Quartermaster building, which was way downtown by the, I can't remember exactly where, but it was by the water somewhere. We had one of those temporary buildings. And they were working on all kinds of things like rubber rafts and the kind of uniform you should have. And one of their important discoveries was the signaling mirror. As a matter of fact, I have one. If you go in the kitchen, you know, those drawers to the right of the stove, there's one that has a mirror in it. I think it's the third to the right.
You still have one?
I still have one. Well, somebody gave it to me. I wished I had one. But this mirror was if you were down in your rubber boat floating around and you heard an airplane way up there, you could focus the mirror so it would flash on the airplane and they could spot where you were, which was very clever. And it took a long time to figure out the directions that anyone could understand them, but that they could be written on this small mirror.
I mean, the directions how to use it?
How to use it.
So they would be useful in the field.
No, so that you could be sitting in your rubber boat and you saw the airplane and you took your mirror and you flashed it. But how are you going to make it work? She found it.
Wow, look at that.
Here it is.
Look at that.
Isn't that amazing? But it has to do,
Can you hold it up?
you see there's a cross here.
Yeah, yeah.
And the cross falls on your hand somewhere, and I haven't read the directions for a long time as to how you, but once you get that cross in the right place, then you hold it like that, and if you can see a flash if you're way miles away. That was one thing that they invented. Then another thing was so you wouldn't be eaten by sharks in the middle of the sea. And Field and Coolidge had friends who were down in Florida who had to do with the Florida fishing and things. And one of their boats caught a shark, and when they opened it up, well, before that, I should tell you that we could never get the Navy to admit that any of their men were eaten by sharks, because they didn't like to write home and say, "Dear Mrs. Macaulay, your son was eaten by a shark." It sounds better to say, "died at sea." So when this fisherman opened up the shark, he found the undigested hand of a man who turned out to be a Navy man. Such jubilation in our office as you can't imagine. So the shark repellent was that the fishermen, used to drag a dead shark behind their fishing boat, and it exuded some kind of chemical that frightened away sharks. And they isolated when it was something like copper sulfate, I don't remember. So they made a cake which was enclosed in a little pouch. And if you felt that sharks were around your rubber raft, you'd open it up and this would spread in the water and the sharks would leave. I don't think much was ever done with it, but I think they do now use it for missiles, which they send up and the missile falls, and if the missile has a shark repellent on it, that will keep the sharks from bumping into it and injuring it.
Amazing.
Well, that was the kind of thing we did. And then, while I was still there, the OSS began to recruit people to go to the Far East. And I knew eventually I'd get to Europe. At that point, I'd only been to Tijuana, and I was anxious to go to Europe sometime, but I knew I'd probably never get to the Far East, so I volunteered. And again, the only thing open was in the files. So I joined up, and we had a long ocean voyage. We all met in Long Beach, California. It was said that we were not supposed to tell anybody where we were going or what we were doing, and it was all so secret. And then we got to this departure thing, and it had a great big sign on it saying, U.S. military departure for the Far East. And we went, I think we had 12 women going over to join the OSS detachment, and we all 12 in a cabin for two sailed to by way of Australia to India, and we got off at Bombay. And I remember sitting out in the harbor at dawn, this kind of mist, and you could smell this strange kind of odor of incense and I don't know what. I thought, gosh, what am I got myself into here?
How long did it take you to go across the ocean?
It took about a month, it seems to me. Well, it was fascinating. We had an interesting time. We were with a group of engineers. No one could figure out who these OSS people were because they didn't have actual uniforms on. We had Gregory Bateson, who was about 6'4", and he always looked as though his pants were falling off. He was a noted anthropologist, and he was over there to study the ways of the native, or whoever they were, Sinhalese and Indians and so forth. Then we finally landed in Bombay, and the next day the docks blew up, and there were big pieces of metal flying through the air. It turned out that there was an ammunition ship in the harbor, and there was another ship, and the ship near it caught fire. But at the time it caught fire, it was lunchtime, and all the British and upper class Indians were off at lunch. There wasn't anyone to do anything about it. So the burning ship ran into the ammunition ship, which blew up. You don't interrupt tea if you're a proper Englishman, do you? And so that was a nice introduction to India. And then we took a train across India to Madras, and that was fascinating to see. And at one point, we were going through a jungle, and a big batch of monkeys flew through the plains, chattering and so forth. The train, I mean. In those days, too, there wasn't much air transport. You did everything by service. And though people were sent over by plane, not very much, because it just wasn't really developed. Then we ended up in Ceylon, or now Sri Lanka, in a beautiful headquarters about halfway. Ceylon is kind of it's a mountainous island, and down by the shore it's tropical. Then you get up to Kandy, where we were, by the sacred lake, and the Temple of the Tooth. That was Buddha's tooth. It was an even 82 the whole year round. And if you went up farther, up to Neuralia, it was 6,000 feet up, and you even had windows that shut during the night. But where we were, everything was open. And so I was in the files there.
Amazing. Did you know where you were going when you left? I mean, did they tell you?
Yes.
Or was
yeah.
it kept?
Oh, we knew sort of that we were in. This was General Mountbatten was the head of this. It was the Southeast Asia, SCAC. And so he was there, established with his minions. Interesting. We're not used to a class society in this country, but Mountbatten, of course, was super upper class. And then as you went down, you were considered other ranks. But the class distinction made a great deal of difference, which was surprising. We were all very middle class in our group. And we had one person who was it? We had Dillon Ripley, a famous ornithologist. He was with us. And he knew the English and knew the class system and also knew some of the Mountbatten people. He got along very well with them. But to us, I mean, we to them were other ranks, which was interesting. We're lucky in this country, we don't have that. So there I was. I had started the files. We were all in palm-thatched huts. And this was very, it's interesting too
This
in
was
that,
in Ceylon?
this was in Candy, Ceylon. That was our OSS headquarters. We're in Ceylon, not too far from the Mountbatten headquarters. But everything was very primitive in India. There it was still really medieval. There were no great big buildings or things like that. I remember in Bombay, there was a wonderful market, a great big open market, all made out of iron and glass, and open, and there up at the very top, there were crows and blackbirds, and they'd swoop down, and grab something and take it back up again. It was very fascinating and primitive. And in Ceylon was the same thing. We all stayed in the Queen's Hotel, which was located on this sacred lake. And the Temple of the Tooth, that was Buddha's tooth, was nearby. And it was I think the English, of course, owned all of it at that point.
It must have been thrilling to be a girl from Pasadena, to have traveled to these foreign countries.
Well, of course, I'd been in New York. Well, I'd been to Tijuana.
We're going to take a break.